think we're right on time. So with that, good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining ThreatX's live Q&A, talking with our experts about how to combat credential stuffing and account takeover attacks. Again, we've purposely designed this webinar to be as interactive as possible. We'll be stopping along the way to launch polls, answer questions that come up in the chat. So please, by all means, don't be shy. And with that, let's go ahead and hop on in to meet our experts. Today, helping me with our session is Alex Gatz, a senior security researcher here at ThreatX. Alex specializes in web and API security, but he also focuses on researching attacks across customer environments, correlating attack techniques to then design, develop, and deploy detection services to proactively protect our customers. So Alex, feel free to come on and say hi.
Hello, thank you.
Lastly, my name's Cindy Cafaro. I'm a product marketer here at ThreatX, focusing on cybersecurity solutions such as API, application security, SOAR, and incident response. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll dive on into the session. Now, this may not be a surprise for a majority of you, but bot traffic does continue to rise and is actually accounted for almost 28% of all web traffic in 2021, up from 25% in 2020. And we continue to see these trends climb. The three most common bot attacks were account takeover, content or price scraping, and scalping to obtain limited available items, making it even harder for consumers to get access to high demand items, which I think we can all sympathize with. The holidays around the corner. Now, according to Javelin's annual identity fraud study, account takeover increased by 90% to cost an estimated $11.4 billion, again, $11.4 billion in 2021 when compared to 2020. Which roughly estimated around 1/4 of all identity fraud losses last year. Now, I think the big question is, how are these bots actually gaining access to accounts? And with that, I'll kick it over to Alex to answer the question.
Absolutely. Yeah, so primarily we're seeing a lot of bots that are just using breach credentials. I mean, just plain and simply. They're using some pretty advanced techniques. They're cycling a number of IP ranges. Maybe they've harvested some devices through a number of attacks. They are massively distributing. I mean, we're seeing, I would say over the past year, even things have almost like 10, 20x the total number of distributed devices that we're seeing. That could be from a number of things, like maybe they're just using new proxies. Maybe they are actually using like new purchased botnets. It's actually a service from the dark web where you can go and essentially like rent a botnet, and you can rent a botnet and you give it the target you want to take on. You maybe give them the credentials you want to use, likely taken from breach credentials, and you just kind of hit point and click and get your money out of it that way. So one thing we wanted to kind of note here is, since we're speaking specifically to credential stuffing, it's slightly different. It's actually a subcategory of brute force attacks. Brute force attacks kind of cover a wide range of things. They can come from a single source. They can come from multiple sources. That can include password guessing, cracking, password spraying, that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Credential stuffing in particular is specific in that it's using only breach credentials. And what they're trying to do is take advantage of the fact that you probably signed up for an account somewhere and you used a certain email address, username, and password combination. And that same username, email, and password combination you've likely used in other places. Unless, like most security professionals, you're using a password management tool to kind of prevent that issue from happening.
Now, Alex, how are these attackers getting access to these huge databases of already compromised credentials? I mean, is this another resource that's available in the dark web or these underground markets? How does that work?
Kind of a combination of all those, I would say. They're absolutely selling breach credentials on the dark web. That is, I would say, fairly common practice. Maybe they are, the attackers may be the ones that actually originally acquired the credentials. Or eventually it seems like the information becomes public domain and everyone gets access to them. And you can kind of find examples of that on, there's a GitHub called Seclist, that's SECLISTS. That's used in some pen testing. I mean, other pen testers, I'm sure, are well aware of places where you can acquire giant lists of known working credentials, at least at some point in time.
And it's interesting that this data just continues to self-feed through multiple other events. I mean, even noting the recent Toyota breach. Could you speak a little bit to that as well, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. So that one sounds like it was related to a private key or an API key that was left in GitHub. I think they're kind of relating that to a DevOps misstep from the sounds of things. And because of that, it looks like they got access to a database with over 300,000 customers' personal data.
So that's what's
That was
fueling the
very
fire.
recent, though. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, once attackers get access to accounts, I think this is, of course, where the next step happens with account takeover. And what I'd like to point out is the use of stolen credentials to gain access to accounts. It isn't a new technique, but the growth of data breaches has really created a snowball effect of attackers reusing passwords stolen from one breach to then attempt to log in and compromise a completely other unrelated system. New research actually recovered that a stunning 15 billion, again, billion credentials circulating on the dark web from over 100,000 breaches in recent years. So I can only imagine that that ammunition available is what makes sense that the system intrusion and brute force attacks continue to be on the rise. We're definitely
Absolutely.
seeing metrics of this. As an example, Verizon's 2020 data breach report identified that the use of stolen credentials has increased from 30% from 2017. But I think the intention behind why that is obvious, which is that attackers, of course, are money motivated. We see a lot of these credential stuffing and account takeover attempts being targeted on banks because it's the quickest bang for their buck. It's the fastest way to turn around a profit. But also selling those credentials when gaining access is another point to turn over a profit as well for attackers. Alex, would you deem that pretty true to what you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love kind of stepping in the attacker's shoes and really trying to dig into the primary motivation behind the attack. I think it really helps paint a clear picture of what the attack is going to look like as it progresses. If you can quickly identify the intention and the goal of any attack, I don't just mean for credential stuffing, then it makes it very clear what the next steps are going to be and how, and also very clear how you should prevent those next steps from progressing.
Absolutely. Now, I did just launch our first poll asking what everybody in the crowd is experiencing today. But I think next is a really interesting part of the analysis that Alex is going to dive into, which is the actual behavior that's being seen in these attacks and, quite frankly, how it's evolving. So we'll close this out in just a few moments. Thank you, everybody that's responded so far. Really appreciate the audience engagement. But again, if you have questions that come to mind as we walk through the content, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll make sure to stop and address those as they come through. Alex, I'll turn it over to you to talk about how these attackers are really flying under the radar.
Awesome. Yeah. So on the right, I think I'll note the first. I think if you click one more time, it kind of zooms in at the top portion. If you click there you go. On the right, so this is an example from a single attack. These are like kind of metadata elements that you would see in a request. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that. So notably, there are 527,000 unique malicious attempts that were made from this. This is all strictly malicious requests, and none of these are false positive. This was all filtered out. From that, there are 13,452 IPs that were being used to make those malicious requests. This was actually over a few hours. I don't think I have an example of that. I'm going to dig into it a bit more in a paper I'm working on currently. So 13,452 IPs were used. You can see TLS fingerprints. They were rotating between about 162 TLS fingerprints, about 826 user agents, and it's a nice way to just getting a unique count once you've kind of filtered your data set down is a really great way to paint a picture of kind of what's happening. On the left, you'll see just user agents. Again, using unique counts, you can kind of bubble up really pertinent information to the attack. And in this case, we found that 3,720,000 attempts were made from a single user agent. Just to be clear, these are from two different attacks. That's why the numbers don't line up there. But you can also see that they were rotating through a number of user agents in this case as well. And we did pick up just it's almost as if they were trying to mimic known good bots and known good scrapers. I would say that's pretty common practice as well. So the three things we were trying to draw attention to here are they're going to use user agent rotation. They're going to use TLS fingerprint rotation. I would say TLS fingerprint rotation is a fairly advanced technique. It takes, maybe you're swapping out elliptic curves. The most advanced samples we saw were trying to mimic like latest browser versions, and they were intentionally kind of cycling through those. That was really interesting. We caught that because sometimes the user agent didn't align with the known TLS fingerprint that should be associated to that browser version. Another really interesting thing we've been seeing is just the use of mobile apps and the use of attacking specifically just the mobile API auth endpoints. That's been huge over the past year. I would say very, very large increase in attempts being made just specifically mimicking mobile devices. So like either using some kind of emulator, maybe they've hijacked a whole bunch of cell phones and they're just using hijacked cell phones, or possibly I've seen speculation around people using cell phone farms from like, as you can imagine, you can buy like tens of thousands of really cheap mobile devices, and maybe you're just kind of proxying that traffic creatively.
Alex, could you help explain how some of these attack tactics are evading past current security solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes maybe like a static signature is all that a solution is going to look at. So maybe they're only looking for a specific user agent, a specific TLS fingerprint, and maybe a combination of those things. Like to this URI, you see this TLS fingerprint and this user agent. They're not actually looking at the behavior of the rotation of those values. That's kind of, I would say, like the nuance there.
Thank you so much, Alex, for going into the detail. It's funny, your hijack cell phone example. I heard of a situation where somebody actually emulated a traffic jam just by taking a bunch of cell phones and walking with them down the
Yeah,
street.
I saw that. They put him in like a Red Ryder wagon, and he had like a whole bunch of cell phones and pulled it over a bridge, and it looked like there was a traffic stop. I saw that same thing. That was really interesting.
Yeah, such an interesting use. But I guess the next example, jumping into how distributed actually are these attacks?
Absolutely. So, not only distributed, but like huge increases in RPS over baseline. The yellow line you see in this graph is actually the baseline traffic over 7 days, and just kind of like averaged out, I think in 30-minute increments, but that's not important here. Notably, the spike of RPS goes up over 3,000. I mean, yes, you could say maybe some really generalized rate limiting would be very helpful here. However, the issue comes down to they're distributing these requests being made over so many IPs that a single IP is making a request maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes apart. It's not like they're making like, I don't know, in the beginning of the year, we could pretty consistently use rules like, hey, this IP made 5 login attempts in 60 seconds. And, we had some good success with that. Things quickly evolved. It's a cat and mouse game, right? So they caught on like, hey, our things are getting blocked when we go at this rate. Let's spread it out more. And then they just kept pushing that further and further and further to where now we're almost seeing like, I don't know, I've seen attacks with 100,000 IPs and one IP is making a request maybe 30 or 45 minutes. But again, if you're able to just kind of setting what I would say like a global, as in non-IP specific rate limiting rules, is very helpful to mitigate some of these, as can be seen here. Maybe you could have limited it down to like, I don't know, 20 RPS in this case.
And it's interesting too how these bots are getting so smart where they can recognize what regions are actually getting blocked and then switch IPs to something that isn't getting blocked and continue the attack forward and actually have those nodes continuing to work as effectively as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's even some speculation around, perhaps there are teams of people, just like you have a SOC, it would be like a red team type, or like a red team from the malicious attacker side that's monitoring like statistics and metrics and like block rates of their botnet attacks that they're selling as a service. That's an interesting area that I was reading about fairly recently.
Wow, that is super interesting. Of course, we want to continue to hear from our crowd, our next poll, really asking what is you and your teams doing today to mitigate credential stuffing and account takeover. Again, we're going to jump into some of our recommendations next, but excited to hear from everybody in the crowd. And again, post any questions as we talk through these topics. We're happy to address anything that comes to mind. It looks like 2FA and MFA are some of the most popular use cases or technologies being used. Account reset only makes sense. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for responding. We'll close that poll again. If there's any questions pop up, please feel free to shout them out. But I think the next piece really diving into how can we actually stop and mitigate these attacks now that we understand what behaviors and how advanced these attacks are getting. What can we do? Alex, do you want to get us started with the top?
Yeah, sure. I kind of touched on this a little bit before. Behavior-based detections, that's a big one. I think that kind of gets confused sometimes. So it's called behavior-based because you're trying to identify like how the attacker is progressing, or like how the attacker is conducting the actual attack, not necessarily looking at like statically what it is attacking, or like where it's attacking. I think that's a nuance that is difficult to understand sometimes. So when we say behavior-based detection, I mean, we're looking at the TLS fingerprint rotation, or like user agent rotation. We're looking at what the attacker is actually doing. And then after maybe they do take over an account, what next steps are they most likely to take? What have we seen in the past? Looking at that behavior as it progresses. Ideally, yeah, you stop everything before it starts. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. And then you need to stop the next steps, like transferring funds out of bank accounts, or like escalating to an admin account and trying to do something more malicious, or maybe getting, hijacking the actual banking server, obviously worst case scenario, and just kind of, progressing that way.
Yeah, to feed on to what you just mentioned, Alex, I mean, obviously being able to identify these attacks, the recon phase is going to be your best case scenario. Understanding the low and slow attacks when people are starting to scrape your websites, understand your attack surface, really doing all the investigation needed to provide the more sophisticated instructions to then reprogram their botnets is one of the best places to ultimately stop the bleeding per se. But the mechanism to be able to actually stop those attacks is also real-time blocking, making sure that you have a solution in place that both provides the detection and the inline blocking is hugely important. Just thinking about processing time, if you have your detection solution that's requiring integrations into a firewall, those integrations take time to get information over. Sometimes it lags. If there's a surge in traffic, like large scale botnet traffic, again, it could take minutes to even have that detection be processed into your firewall. So I would emphasize not only the need for real-time blocking, but having a solution where real-time blocking and the detection is baked into one solution is going to hugely benefit your team and ultimately stop the bleeding as fast as possible.
Absolutely.
The third one might be obvious, and I appreciate everybody responding to the poll that we just launched. But again, emphasizing the need for 2FA, MFA, and password expiration policies. We just heard about how compromised credentials are on the rise and how they're going to continue to be used. So taking account those best practices, enabling folks in your company to not reshare and reuse passwords from their personal, from their business lives. Using a password manager is going to be one of the best and safest practices that you can start to adopt in your technology, hygiene, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to be clear, we're not saying use just one of these things, security and layers, right? So, yeah, you should use real-time blocking and 2FA. And we've seen in the past examples of 2FA kind of falling flat on its face too recently. So,
Awesome. The last
um,
piece is really monitoring any compromised credentials. Alex, do you want to explain how we do that in practice?
yeah, absolutely. So there's services out there that'll kind of like hunt for any breach data and they'll notify you if your credentials have popped up. I think even like LastPass does that by itself, or they'll let you know if you've reused passwords on more than one account and they'll advise against that. For like a personal use, I would say use something like Have I Been Pwned or like Have I Been, yeah. So that's more like, hey, have my credentials been breached? Where have they been breached? And it will give you a breakdown. Like you plug in an email, it'll show you like, I don't know, they were breached at American Airlines, they were breached at Uber, they were breached at Toyota, they were breached. It kind of tracks all of that for you once they get a hold of the breach credentials, and they'll run a search for you.
I also can't emphasize enough the use of user behavior analytics. When somebody is in an account, understanding if their activity is suspicious is also hugely beneficial. It kind of feeds into the behavior analysis piece that we hit on earlier, being able to see an attack escalating permissions, starting to change their passwords when it doesn't make sense. Maybe your password expiration policy was up 20, 30 days ago and they still have an extra 60 days. That's suspicious. So being aware of course, normal behavior versus suspicious behavior, if somebody does actually get to the point of compromising an account, is ultimately going to be the biggest tip off as well. We
Absolutely.
do have a question in our chat. How much do dedicated bot solutions typically cost? As far as a dollar amount, I can't tell you off the top of my head because I believe it varies from vendor to vendor. Not only that, but there is a slew of options besides dedicated and also built-in bot capabilities. But what I will say is that when you start to look at solutions that only cover one area at a time, that's going to create a disjointed view in your security program. And I think the biggest thing is that attackers don't look at attacking your infrastructure with only one technique in mind. They use a variety of techniques and every tool in their tool belt when designing these sophisticated attacks. So my biggest recommendation is looking for a combined solution that ultimately is going to give you the full picture of what suspicious or malicious behavior is going on in your environment. Alex, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to build on top of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. The whole industry seems like it's going like like whatever solution is more comprehensive, like whatever solution is going to give you the biggest picture, whatever solution is going to give you like say an inventory of your attack surface. I think there's a combination of routes you could go with that.
Closing out, I know we only have a few minutes left. The effects of what account takeovers can lead to can be immeasurable when it comes to diminishing brand reputation or loss in consumers' trust. But what is measurable is the amount of records or data extracted from breaches and the damages owed. So in total, just this year leading up to October, there's been about 48 breaches so far in 2022. But to name a few high-profile ones, as Alec recently mentioned, American Airlines was breached by an attacker gaining access to multiple employees' emails. They claim it was only a small amount of consumers' personal information that was exposed. Thankfully, none of it was financial, but it did cover personal identifiable information such as birth dates, addresses, social security numbers, first, middle, last name, etc. The second is a brand that I also hold near and dear to my heart. I'm sure others do as well. The North Face was reported that 200,000 customer accounts were compromised due to a credential stuffing attack. Both of these attacks happened in September, coincidentally enough this year, so just this last month. The credential stuffing attack was targeted on the North Face website. Again, thankfully, no PCI or financial data was exposed because they did have encryptions in place where they didn't hold credit card and payment information in their system. I believed they integrated with another service that used a token to be able to decrypt that information, which made it even harder for attackers to try to get access to that. But what was compromised was personal identifiable information. So again, addresses, first name, last name, social security numbers, etc., making it even easier for somebody to impersonate your identity, unfortunately. Now, the last breach is not from this year, but it's one that is very notable that happened last year, which is T-Mobile. They suffered a massive data breach of exposing 54 million Americans PII from a brute force attack on one of their test sites. It eventually led to access to an IT server where all these records were held. But the most recent news with this is that it did actually reach settlement this week of around 350 million. That settlement was just for the users. It didn't account for additional damages. So that should give you some idea of scale for what these organizations are facing when it comes to these data breaches affecting their organizations. Now, these are only but a few examples of how businesses and consumers are impacted by data breaches, really stemming from account takeover and credential stuffing. Now, with that, I realize we're at our last few minutes. Again, we thank everybody for joining us today. We'd love to hear how valuable this session was to you. Feel free to respond to the poll. With our last few minutes, I'd really just like to thank everybody for joining. And we'll be having our next live Q&A November 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 Pacific, with Dole Fari and Nick Alex, the authors of Black Hat GraphQL, and also founders of DEF CON Toronto. We're going to be talking about modern web application attacks. So we certainly hope to see you there. And Alex, thanks again for joining me for the session today.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure.
Perfect. With that, we'll relinquish everybody. We hope everyone has a great rest of your Thursday, and we look forward to seeing you on the next ThreatX Live Q&A.